There's a photograph that no one in the Walker family talks about. It sits in a shoebox in an attic in rural Kentucky, curling at the edges, the faces staring out with expressions that don't quite match the occasion. A wedding, 1921, the bride is 16, the groom is her uncle, and if you look closely at the guests standing behind them, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. They're all related, not just cousins. Not just distant branches of the same tree, they are the tree. The same names appear over and over. The same bloodlines twist back into themselves like a knot that was never meant to be untied. This isn't a story about one family. This is a story about what happens when a family becomes a circle, when the branches stop reaching outward and start growing inward, when the tree doesn't just have roots in one place, it has roots in one person. Over and over again, in 2019, a woman named Claire Walker uploaded her DNA to a genealogy website. She was looking for answers about her grandfather, a man who disappeared from all records after 1955. What she found instead was a map, a family map that didn't make sense, lines that shouldn't connect, marriages between people who shared the same grandparents, children born to parents who were also cousins. And then siblings, and then closer. The algorithm flagged it immediately. Pedigree collapse, that's the clinical term. It means your family tree isn't a tree anymore, it's a wreath, and Claire's family had been collapsing for over 100 years. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't ignorance, this was a choice, made again and again in small towns across Appalachia, the Deep South, and the American frontier, where isolation wasn't just geographic. It was genetic, and the consequences didn't show up in one generation. They compounded, they buried themselves in the blood, and when they finally surfaced, no one wanted to speak their name. The Walker family didn't start in Kentucky. They started in Virginia in the 1780s, when land was cheap and the government didn't ask questions. Thomas Walker claimed 200 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills and built a cabin with his wife, Mary. They had 9 children. By the time the youngest was born, the oldest had already married, and here's where it begins. The oldest son, Joseph, married a woman named Elena. Elena was Mary's sister. His aunt. In the census records, it's listed plainly. No one tried to hide it, because in 1798, it wasn't illegal. It was practical. Elena was already living with them. She knew the land. She knew the family. And when you're trying to survive in the wilderness, you don't marry for love. You marry for labor, for survival, for keeping the land in the family. Joseph and Elena had 6 children, and those 6 children married within the same small circle. Because by then, there were no neighbors. The nearest settlement was a day's ride. So they married each other, cousins to cousins, and then cousins to siblings of cousins. The family Bible tracked it all. Births, deaths, marriages, the names started repeating. Thomas, Mary, Joseph, Elena, over and over, like echoes. By 1850, the Walker family had spread across 3 counties, but genetically, they had barely moved at all. A study done in 2003 by a geneticist at the University of Kentucky analyzed the DNA of living descendants. They found that the genetic diversity within the Walker line was equivalent to that of a group of siblings. Not cousins, siblings. That means for every generation, the gene pool shrank. Recessive traits had nowhere to hide. Blue eyes became universal. So did a specific type of jawline, and so did the disorders. Deafness appeared in the 1870s, then blindness, then children who didn't live past 5. The family called it bad luck. They called it God's will, but the doctors who came through those counties knew what it was. They'd seen it before, in royal families, in isolated religious communities, in any population that turned inward for too long. The body starts to remember what it's supposed to forget, By 1920, the Walker family had a reputation. People in town didn't say it out loud, but they knew. The children looked different. They moved different. There was a boy named Samuel who was born in 1917. His parents were second cousins. His grandparents were first cousins. His great-grandparents were siblings who married into the same family. Samuel was blind by age 7. He had seizures. He couldn't speak in full sentences, but the family didn't send him away. They kept him close. Because that's what you did. You didn't talk about it. You didn't let outsiders see. You just lived with it. And if someone asked, you said he was delicate, that he'd been touched by something, that God had a plan. But the church records tell a different story. Between 1900 and 1930, the Walker family buried 42 children under the age of 10, 42 in one family. The causes listed were vague: fever, weakness, failure to thrive, but the pattern was unmistakable. The deeper the inbreeding, the shorter the lives. And still, they kept marrying each other, because by then, it wasn't just tradition, it was identity. To marry outside the family meant losing the land, losing the name, losing the story they told themselves about who they were. So they stayed, and the tree kept looping. In one implode, a doctor from Lexington visited the family after a local priest asked him to investigate. His notes, kept in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, are clinical and cold. He writes about children with webbed fingers, about a teenage girl with no ability to process language, about a man in his 30s who had the cognitive ability of a 6-year-old. And then he writes this: they do not see themselves as afflicted. They see themselves as chosen, as pure. They believe the outside world is the contamination, not the blood they share. The doctor left. He filed no report because what could he do? They weren't breaking any laws and they didn't want help. They wanted to be left alone, so the county did, and the family continued, generation after generation, until the consequences were no longer invisible. Claire Walker didn't know any of this when she sent in her DNA. She was just trying to find her grandfather. His name was Raymond. He'd left the family in 1955 and never came back. No letters, no phone calls. He just vanished. Her grandmother refused to talk about him. So did her mother. When Claire pressed, they'd say he was troubled, that he made a choice, that some doors are better left closed. But Claire needed to know, so she swabbed her cheek and mailed it in. 6 weeks later, she got her results, and the first thing she noticed was the ethnicity estimate. It said she was 97% European, specifically British and Irish. That wasn't unusual for someone from Kentucky. But then she saw the matches, dozens of them, all with the same last name, Walker, and when she clicked into the family tree the site had generated, she saw it. The loops, her great-grandfather appeared in 4 different places. Her great-grandmother was listed as both a cousin and an aunt. The same people kept showing up, in different roles, different generations. But always the same blood. She called the customer service line. She thought it was a mistake. The representative put her on hold. When they came back, they said the results were accurate. They explained what pedigree collapse was. They told her it was more common than people think, especially in isolated populations. They were polite, professional, but Claire could hear it in their voice. Pity. She hung up and stared at the screen. And that's when she saw the health risks. The site had flagged her for elevated chances of genetic disorders, autoimmune diseases, neurological conditions, higher susceptibility to certain cancers, not because of one gene, but because the same genes kept being passed down over and over with no variation, no repair. Her body wasn't just hers, it was a compilation, an archive of every choice her ancestors made, every marriage that looped back. Every time they chose blood over the outside world, and now she was carrying it, the weight of a family that had turned into itself, a family that had chosen survival over diversity, purity over health. And she had no idea what to do with that knowledge. Claire started digging. She requested birth certificates, marriage licenses, census records. She drove to county courthouses in 3 states, and what she found was a pattern that went beyond her family. The Walkers weren't alone. In the same counties, there were the Caudles, the Fugats, the Richies, all families with the same genetic signatures, all families that had married within themselves for generations. Some of it was geography. These were mountain families, hollow families, people who lived miles from the nearest town where the road didn't reach until the 1950s. But some of it was choice. There were families who could have married out, who had opportunities, but didn't because they believed something, that their blood was special, that mixing with outsiders would weaken them, that God had set them apart. Claire found letters written in the 1890s by a Walker matriarch named Iris. In one, she writes to her daughter, warning her not to marry a man from town. She says, "We are of the old line, we keep what is ours. The world outside is corrupt and fallen. We stay pure, pure." That word appeared over and over in letters, in diaries, in family Bibles. It wasn't just about land, it was about identity, about believing that isolation was protection, that the bloodline was sacred. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have walked away or stayed to protect the family name? Claire kept searching, and then she found Raymond, her grandfather, the man who disappeared. He hadn't died, he'd escaped. In 1955, he married a woman from Ohio, someone with no connection to the family. No shared ancestors. The family disowned him. They struck his name from the Bible. Claire found a letter he'd written to his mother in 1968. He says, "I couldn't stay. I couldn't bring a child into that. I loved you, but I loved the future more." He'd seen it. The sickness, the silence, the way the family bent inward like a collapsing star, and he'd chosen to break the cycle, but it cost him everything. His mother never wrote back. His siblings never spoke to him again. He died in 1992, alone, in a nursing home in Cleveland, and the family never claimed his body. The science behind what happened to the Walker family isn't controversial. It's documented. When a population becomes reproductively isolated, especially through repeated close relative marriages, the gene pool shrinks. Harmful recessive genes, the ones that usually get diluted or bred out, start to surface. Generation after generation, they accumulate. You see it in royal families across Europe. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, hemophilia, mandibular prognathism, infertility, stillbirths, the same traits appearing over and over because the genetic deck is no longer being shuffled. It's being stacked. In the Walker family, the traits were different, but the mechanism was the same. Deafness linked to a mutation in the GGB2 gene, blindness from retinal degeneration, cognitive disabilities tied to deletions in chromosome 15. These weren't random, they were inherited, passed down from parents who were also cousins, from grandparents who were also siblings, each generation narrowing the possibilities, limiting the outcomes, until the body couldn't adapt anymore. But here's the part that haunts Claire the most. It didn't have to be this way. There were moments when it could have stopped, when someone could have married outside the family, when a child could have been sent to a school in another county, when the loop could have been broken, but it wasn't, because the family chose the loop. They chose the story they told themselves, that they were special, that they were pure, that the outside world had nothing to offer them, And the cost of that story was paid in the bodies of children who never made it to adulthood, in young men and women who couldn't read, couldn't hear, couldn't see, in lives that were shorter and harder than they ever needed to be. The Walker family didn't collapse because of bad luck. They collapsed because of belief, a belief so strong that it overrode biology, that it sacrificed the future for the past. And the evidence is still there, in the DNA, in the medical records, in the graveyards where the headstones are small and close together, where the same last names repeat, where the dates tell the story no one wanted to speak out loud. Claire doesn't talk to most of her family anymore. When she tried to share what she'd found, they shut her out. They said she was stirring up shame, that she was disrespecting the dead, that some things are meant to stay buried, but she couldn't let it go because it wasn't just history, it was her blood, her future. She's 32 now, she's not married. She's not sure she wants children, because every time she thinks about it, she thinks about the tree, about the loops, about what she might pass down without meaning to. The geneticist she spoke with told her the risk is manageable, that one generation of outbreeding can restore a lot of diversity, that her children, if she has them with someone unrelated, would likely be fine. But the word likely isn't enough, not when you've seen the records. Not when you've walked through the cemeteries and counted the graves of children who are buried beneath stones that just say infant or beloved baby, with no name at all. She still has the photograph. The one from 1921, the wedding. She keeps it not as a relic, but as a reminder that love and survival and family are not always the same thing, that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who thought they were protecting us. The Walker family believed they were preserving something sacred, but what they preserved was pain, a genetic echo that still reverberates today, in the bodies of the living, in the descendants who didn't ask for this inheritance but carry it anyway. Claire started a blog. She writes about genetic genealogy, about what DNA testing reveals, about the families who find out, like she did, that their tree isn't a tree at all. She gets messages from people all over the country, from the South, from Appalachia, from the Midwest, people who uploaded their DNA and saw the loops, who realized their parents were cousins, that their grandparents were siblings, and they all ask the same question. What do I do now? Claire tells them the truth. You can't change the past. You can't undo the choices your ancestors made, but you can stop the loop. You can be the break. You can choose differently, and maybe that's the only way forward. Not by forgetting, not by hiding, but by remembering what happens when a family turns inward, when it mistakes isolation for purity, when it sacrifices the future on the altar of the past. The Walker family tree doesn't grow anymore. It just circles, and somewhere in Kentucky, in an attic no one visits, there's a box of photographs, faces staring out, waiting for someone to finally tell their story. This is that story, and it's not over yet.